Although I've talked about it before on some of my other videos, I think it's very appropriate to give Scapeshift its own episode of Slaying the Beast, considering it's a very popular deck. As a Magic player myself, it took me a really long time to figure out how to slay this beast, but once I did, the feeling is actually very rewarding, considering this deck is a real challenge to beat. Although it's absurdly popular, Scapeshift decks were not always legal in Modern, and this was because Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, which is one of the key cards in this deck, was banned at, I believe, the start of the format, or at least early on in the format's run. But once it became unbanned, this deck just spread like wildfire. Before we discuss the cards to bring in against this matchup, it's important that we lay out the ground rules first about what you should be thinking about when facing this deck. It's important to note that there are actually several different kinds of Scapeshift decks, but most of them are incredibly similar. If you haven't watched my other video discussing Scapeshift, the idea behind Scapeshift is that the Scapeshift player is going to use ramp spells to get to around 6 or 7 lands. The idea is they want to get over 7. They can actually win with 6, but it's a lot easier to win with 7 or more. Once they have 7 or more lands, they're going to use Scapeshift to fetch 2 copies of Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, and the rest of the lands that they fetch will be mountains. Considering that all the lands enter the battlefield at the same time, both of the Valakuts are going to trigger for each mountain that entered play with it, so it will do a lot of damage. In this matchup, timing is everything. Every spell you play will more than likely determine whether you win or lose. This is an absolutely frustrating process because some decks are just built so they can't really do anything about Scapeshift, and this is why the deck is so popular. Rather than a fair game of Magic, Scapeshift is going to cut corners and try to win in the fastest way possible, and that's of course ramping to Scapeshift. And considering ramp can go pretty fast, you usually have roughly 4 or 5 turns, unless the Scapeshift deck gets unlucky. Aggro decks have a bit of an advantage in this matchup, considering both aggro decks and Scapeshift are racing against the clock. However, the thing Scapeshift decks love to do against this matchup is use board wipes like Pyroclasm or Fire Spout. Considering aggro decks like to attack with a lot of little creatures, these spells are absolutely atrocious if you're playing an aggro deck, because you'll have to rebuild your board state all over again, and considering you're on a clock, you probably won't have a whole lot of time to do this. If you're an aggro deck, you need some way to counter this, or it's really helpful to have some way to counter this. My favorite way to do this is Boros Charm. You need to splice red and white or play red and white, but it's excellent against Pyroclasm, and if they don't get the Pyroclasm, you can just throw it at your opponent. If you don't play red-white, another thing I actually find really good against Pyroclasm, at least, is Atarka's Command, believe it or not. And the reason is you want to use it defensively, and you want to choose modes to pump your creatures and either prevent life gain or do damage, whatever the situation follows. But with it, it can save your guys and allow you to attack with them one more time, and that's more than likely going to make the difference in the game. Another card that I'm surprised a lot of aggro and even mid-range decks don't really use is Thalia, Guardian of Thrabian. This is excellent because it not only makes cards like Pyroclasm and Fire Spout cost more, it makes all their ramp spells a lot worse. And it essentially will give you that extra turn you need to do a little more damage. Of course, they can lightning bolt it, so that's the only real downside, but you at least get them to spend a turn killing it and allow them not to ramp for at least one turn. It's also important to note that some combo decks like Pyromancer's Ascension or even Goryo's Vengeance actually have a pretty big advantage, considering Scapeshift decks like to ramp and are more prepared to deal with creatures with cards like Pyroclasm. Decks like this are at least have a pretty big advantage in game 1 because the Scapeshift deck simply is not prepared for them. However, you're going to have to probably side in some sort of counterspell or a way to protect your combo, because they're going to probably bring in counterspells, unless they're not playing blue. If they're playing, say, maybe the red-green version or even the Jund version, which is a thing, you'll probably have a big advantage, but you should still be considerate and try to protect your combo as best you can, because they will more than likely bring in some hate against it. If you're not playing an aggro or a combo deck, this matchup can be notorious. And this is where we're going to be going over the cards that can potentially help you with it. White has a lot of great anti-search cards like Aven Mind Sensor and Leonin Arbiter. These cards are excellent because when they try to Scapeshift, you can drop something like the Mind Sensor and just limit your opponent to the amount of cards that they can search for. Another creature I actually really love in this matchup is Gaddock. Considering the only real removal Scapeshift has is Pyroclasms and occasionally Lightning Bolts or Electrolyze, Gaddock is an absolute nightmare considering they can't cast either Scapeshift or Cryptic Command. Plus, he's something you can attack with, so they have to take at least some time out of their game plan to deal with him. Another great white card would be Nevermore, or Meddling Mage, that works too. But Nevermore is, I think, a little bit safer just because the Scapeshift deck doesn't really run a whole lot of enchantment removal in the main board, but you should still be careful. Don't just assume that you're safe when it's out. In my opinion, the scariest form of Scapeshift is the red, green, blue version, because they have counterspells to protect their combo. If you also play blue, get ready to have a counterspell war when they try to combo off. The moment they cast Scapeshift, they're likely going to tap out all their lands just so they have mana saved up so they can have a counterspell to protect the Scapeshift from whatever they're doing. So be sure to have counterspells that both counter instants and sorceries, or have the potential to counter instants and sorceries. However, the thing is, if your opponent knows that you're playing blue, they're likely going to side in a copy of Boseiju who shelters all so that the Scapeshift cannot be countered. Because of this, you might want to bring a Tectonic Edge or a Ghost Quarter along just to deal with this land. Oddly enough, my favorite counter against Scapeshift is actually Shadow of Doubt. And seriously, Shadow of Doubt is absolutely awesome in this match, considering it just essentially just prevents your opponent from Scapeshifting, and you get a card out of it. It's also pretty efficient, and if you need to use it early, you likely will be able to, considering you can also use it to counter ramp spells as well, if you just realize your opponent is struggling. If you're going to go with hand attack, my favorite choice in this matchup is actually Thoughtseize, considering you want to be able to have a versatile choice of what cards to take from your opponent. If they don't have a Scapeshift right away, it's probably best to take one of the ramp spells, but Thoughtseize is the best because your life total really is not going to matter in this matchup, because when they Scapeshift, it usually doesn't really matter how much life you have. They'll usually be able to kill you anyway because they'll be able to do so much damage to you. Cards like Surgical Extraction are also an absolute beating. When you're going after a card, it may seem obvious to hit Scapeshift, but if you can't hit Scapeshift in the graveyard, you can also try to hit Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, because the deck usually needs that to win the game. Since red and green decks usually have to use aggressive measures to beat a deck like this, it's also good to keep in mind that land destruction is also a pretty relevant force, although I wouldn't really recommend designing a whole deck to be based around land destruction. Getting rid of a land for a turn can make a big difference, considering that the Scapeshift deck needs 6 to 7 lands to actually win. If you were only to pick one land destruction spell against this matchup, I would highly recommend Crumble to Dust for the same reason I would recommend something like Surgical Extraction. A couple more important things you should know about facing Scapeshift is Scapeshift usually is not the only way the deck has to win. To mix things up, they would likely throw in a Primeval Titan, or maybe even have a few copies of Primeval Titan in the main board, considering that Primeval Titan can also fetch out the Valakut the Molten Pinnacle and slowly kill you by just attacking and fetching more mountains as the game progresses. Because of this, you may want to have a counterspell that also hits instants and sorceries and creatures, so that way you can take care of all three if they happen. Or you may just want to side in maybe a 1 of or a 2 of a particular removal spell that can deal with creatures in general. Liliana the Veil is particularly nice in this matchup, considering you can plus her up and get rid of your opponent's hand, and if they drop a Titan, you can just make them sack it. While I haven't seen in a while, there is actually another Scapeshift deck that actually doesn't run Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. It actually runs landfall creatures like Steppe Lynx and Plated Geopede, and it actually uses Scapeshift to pump those creatures an absurd amount before they attack for a pretty considerable amount of damage. I haven't seen this build in a while, and it is kind of funny and interesting, but it's not likely going to be the kind of Scapeshift deck you're going to be facing these days. So now that you know what to do, and you know that you're going to be facing Scapeshift at your next sanctioned event, feel free to follow these strategies, and if you play your cards right, you will slay this beast. I hope this video has been of some help to you. If there's a deck in a constructed format that you're having trouble defeating, feel free to let me know about it, and I'll make an episode about how to beat that deck. Again, thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and surgically extract that subscribe button. My name is Respector, and I'll see you all next time.